Well, welcome back to Dr. Y. We've had another viewer question. Dear Dr. Y, why can't we use an expired butterfly needle for a blood collection? Well, that's an interesting question. Historically, butterfly needles did not expire. In fact, when looking up supplies for this, I managed to find an old butterfly that did not have an expiry date. So has our correspondent discovered some new conspiracy theory? Well, no, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but more interesting than that too. What I discovered in preparation was that a straight needle has an expiry date of 5 years and a butterfly has an expiry date of 2 years. Well, why that difference? So I did the natural thing. I asked the manufacturer. And unfortunately, their response wasn't terribly useful. It was sort of a vague response that there are multiple reasons and you're not going to use one past the expiry date, so don't worry about it. That's not a good enough answer for Dr. Y. So we're going to try and figure out why. So the first thing to consider is, what is an expiration date? Well, as we said before, not all products have an expiration date, although increasingly we're seeing more manufacturing dates at least put onto products, which is useful for inventory management and for recalls, but not useful for expiration. Health Canada requires an expiration date when there's a statistical chance that the device is not going to be worked as expected by that date. It's up to the manufacturer to decide on what that exactly means. So what means not working like expected for a butterfly? Well, I can think of 3 things. We can be looking at things like sterility, we could be looking at the product integrity, or we could be looking at packaging integrity. So let's consider each one of those 3. So we'll start with sterility. There are 3 main ways to sterilize things. We can use a chemical method, we can use a radiation method, or we can do thermal methods. Which one is used for a butterfly needle? I'm not certain, but it doesn't make a big difference. If you were to achieve perfect sterility, so no bacteria, no spores present, then you would expect to have no growth at any point in the future, since bacteria cannot spontaneously form. However, mathematically, we can never say there are no bacteria present. It's possible that bacteria or spores could be trapped in some little pore and not have received that full treatment, and so may persist. And so sterility is defined as the amount that you're able to reduce the number of bacteria. Typically, for a clean object, about 1/1,000,000th of the level of the general environment. And then the expiration date is a statistical measurement of how likely that small number of bacteria left will have grown into a number which are high enough to cause a problem. But what sort of problems are we going to have with a butterfly needle that may have some bacteria? Well, I can think of 2 main ones. One, you could have bacteria in your butterfly needle and that could get into your sample. If your sample happened to be, say, a blood culture, well, suddenly you've now got a falsely positive blood culture. But it could get even worse. What if your bacteria were to go from your needle into the patient? Now you've infected the patient. And that's some really good reasons to not use an expired needle. But it doesn't tell us the whole answer. Why is there one has got 5 years and one's got 2 years? So we're only partway there. So the next thing we're going to consider is the integrity of it. We know plastics degrade over time. And this is particularly a problem once you get to the soft plastics. The plasticizers can volatilize out, causing the plastic to become brittle. And certainly we see soft plastics in our butterfly where we don't see it in the straight needle. So what's the big deal if you get a little bit of brittleness to your tubing? Well, you could get air into there. So again, if you had, say, an anaerobic culture and you've got air coming in, well, you don't have an anaerobic culture anymore. You've got an aerobic culture, so you're not getting what you think. Or if you had a regular sample and you had air getting in there, well, now what's going to happen is it's going to fill more slowly and it's going to fill incompletely. Not desirable outcomes. But it can get even worse. Let's say you have very, very brittle tubing and it breaks. Now you have a mess on your hand, which is now a biohazard and you've got to clean up. So again, this might be a reason that we have a shorter expiry date on the butterfly compared to the straight needle. Another consideration is that we have a metal needle attached to the plastic. The metal needle is going to be stable for a very long time, and due to the nature of it, we're not going to have particular problems with sharpness of the needle. But it does have a different expansion coefficient than the plastic. So every time the temperature changes, it will get a little bit of stress on that joint, and that joint could eventually break. If that joint were to break, well, the needle could separate from the plastic housing. On the easiest case, that gives us an air leak, as we saw with the tubing. Worst case, that needle might come out. You've now got a free needle with no safety device on, so you've got a needle stick hazard for yourself as a phlebotomist. But worse, for the patient, that needle could actually now get stuck into the skin entirely. Now you've got a much bigger problem. Another consideration is that under the effects of heat and gravity, plastics can deform over time. The safety device on a butterfly is much more complicated than we see on the straight needle, and so is much more prone to failure, and so maybe another reason why the butterfly has that shorter expiration time. But I don't think any of this is the main explanation. I think the biggest difference is the packaging itself. A straight needle has some very simple rigid plastic around it, and that's all it contains. Whereas the butterfly has got some soft plastic, which is glued to some paper. And so paper, plastic, glue, they can all degrade, as we talked about, for the device itself. But it gets more complicated. These devices are also going to be rattling against other ones in your cart, especially if you have them free in a basket. Or you may have some device falling onto it. Anytime you do that, you're going to cause some extra abrasion. And that abrasion can lead to a micro tear, which means that now there's a pathway in for the bacteria to get into your thing, so destroying your sterility ahead of time. And so I suspect that's actually the major part. But it also raises a really important point about expiration dates, namely that they're contingent on you having the right environmental conditions. Now, for a butterfly, it's going to be straightforward. It's going to be basic year room conditions. But some people mishandle them. Maybe get stored on top of a refrigerator, or maybe get stored on a radiator, or perhaps put in a window for storage locations. None of those are temperature controlled to the same amount, and so the sterility may not even be as long as in the written date. And expired needles are a problem. Healthcare is a major source of pollution in this world, and we need to minimize that. So how can we minimize the number of expired phlebotomy needles? Well, the first thing is to pay attention to the number that you need. Don't over-order it. Keep track of your inventory to make sure you don't have some, but also in the inventory, make sure that your oldest ones are where people are going to grab. You want to use your oldest ones first. A worst case scenario is that one box gets pushed to the back and doesn't get used until it expires. And I know over the last few years we've had a lot of problems with supply chains and abilities to get a hold of butterfly needles, and there's been a big temptation of people to create personal secret stashes of them. Resist that temptation. Caches get forgotten about, and every now and then we'll find one, and we have to deal with some needles which have now expired. What to do with the expired needles? Well, as long as you keep it under control, you can actually find other uses for it. For example, we direct ours to training purposes, in-house, one of the various phlebotomy colleges, or BCIT. Unfortunately, because you can't really reprocess these devices very easily, developing nations and other agencies have no interest in expired phlebotomy needles. So going back to our original question, can we use an expired one? No, we cannot use an expired phlebotomy needle. If you were to use one, the reality is the day after it expires, everything's probably going to be fine, but it's a statistical thing. So at times your medical director or Health Canada may extend the dates on the expiration after careful consideration of your risks and benefits. But as a phlebotomist, you really should not be extending it intentionally on your own, because you're taking liability for problems with your patient, for risks to yourself, and to risks to the specimen. So hopefully that answers your question. I really enjoyed this one. So please keep those questions coming in, and I'll see you next time on Dr. Y.